Thanks, Carson, and thanks, Ted. Thank you for organizing this event, and thank you for inviting me. Being a SIGA affiliate has lots of perks, and this is one of them. It strikes me on a slightly more serious note that as much as a joy as it is to see you all again, and many of you, I think it's been at least 3 years since I think I've seen anybody in this room. Only bad things have happened since. You should invite me more often. Maybe that won't happen. No, I think, if I kind of look out at a room full of young scholars and people that care deeply about development and outcomes in conflict spaces, it's all bad, right? There's the COVID distraction. There's the Ukraine distraction. Together, those things may move progress backwards by decades in many of the places that we really care about. There's disinformation that, except for Claire, nobody knows what to do about. And the climate challenges come more and more into focus. And we know, based on Ted's work and work of others, that the places with the worst governance are the ones that are going to be the most vulnerable, just because they start out being fragile. And so I want to give you some words of hope. So first of all, let me just say that, when things are really bad for the people that you care about, well, that's when they need you the most. There's the glass half full. The other thing is that we're incremental optimists, the economists, right? You just saw lots and lots of examples of some things that work and some things that don't work, and we could do more of the things that work. I'm thinking of Michael's paper and Tarek's paper, and less of the things that don't work. And if compared to where we were 20 years ago in this field, we know so much more. And one part of the reason that we know a lot more, and this is one of the themes that I want to bring out in the panel, is because there's been this incremental effort of building and evidence to action and evidence to theory to action and action that feeds back to evidence that feeds back to action. And these institutions, and I'll include ESOC in that, have worked really, really hard at all of that. The other thing I want to say to the young scholars is that another thing that's really changed is that you can now get tenure working on development in conflict space and thinking of conflict. Violent could be the Y variable in your regressions, or attitudes, or the amount of disinformation can be the outcome variable in those regressions, and that's now acceptable even among economists. And that certainly wasn't true 15 years ago. Maybe it started being true maybe 10 years ago, something like that. Now it's absolutely true. Are the alumni of these programs have tenure in lots of places. So that's kind of good news. Okay, so I know it's late, and so we're going to entertain you by telling stories, but pay attention because all the stories have some kind of a moral to them. All right, I'm going to start in my long-winded introduction by telling a story. I got started in this business with a project that was published maybe a decade ago and started before that, where me and Joe Felter and Jake Shapiro, who've been mentioned here, studied how development projects, the billions of dollars that were being spent in Iraq and Afghanistan on development projects, and they came to us and said, well, you guys are kind of development economists, kind of sort of. What's the best way to spend this money in order to reduce violence? And we said, well, if you share the data and tell us what your theory is, we'll work on that. And this was you could describe this as evidence to action. We came up with some very clear findings for them. When you spend less than $50,000 a project, this is the most cost-effective method that you have of reducing violence. They weren't doing dispute adjudication, so I don't know if that one counts, but it's incredibly cost-effective. When you spend more than $100,000 on a project, you're increasing violence. And now we'll explain to you why. You're creating targets, you're not consulting with the local community, you're doing all the things that development practitioners know not to do, but you're doing them anyway. So now, if I said, and based on those findings, they really did change how they behaved. They did more of the little stuff and less of the big stuff in all kinds of ways that I could describe in detail if you liked. Now, if I just stopped there, we would say evidence to action, check. But what I have to tell you is that there wasn't just that one evidence to action little arrow in this story. In order to get the evidence, we worked for 3 years and flew back and forth to Afghanistan and Iraq multiple times. We had one of us, Felter, actually rotated through the U.S. military in uniform, and had he not done that, we never would have got the casualty data, which is now the basis of much of the work in this field. Once we'd established, so we borrowed, stealed, broke things, had way too much, consumed way too much alcohol with practitioners in order to get to that first step, to the evidence. Once we had it demonstrated, it wasn't as if, I go to my general practitioner, I say, hey, here's a new article on how you can reduce my blood pressure. Why don't you try this medication? No, because that assumes that my GP is already doing all the right things. My GP actually is. So it's just like an envelope theorem. He's already at the maximum. You give him a little information, evidence to action, he does it, right? No. We're talking about fragile places, right? When you arrive, you find out that there's a whole bunch of things that we knew 10 years ago that they're not even doing yet, including, paying the young men to clean up garbage at the sides of streets and thinking hundreds of millions of dollars spent on this, which employs lots of young men, some of whom are also ISIS. And so evidence to action, no. From the evidence to the action, there was another network, somewhat overlapping with the people that gave us the data, of practitioners who had to be talked into this and government officials who had to be convinced. And there was a whole lobbying effort that included congressional testimony in order for us to get to the action stage. All right? So what I want to tell you some of you know this already, but some of you are a little young still, so I'll tell you. The institutions, there's the networks that we create in order to get the evidence. Then there's the stuff that goes into the paper. And then from that to the action, those are serious efforts by people that just do it because they believe that this is a good thing to do. Now, you could get a PhD and you could even get tenure doing the first two steps. And if you're really lucky, your thesis advisor, someone like Ted or Isla, already has that network in their pocket, and they're just going to bring you the evidence, and you're going to write up the paper with them, and you don't have to worry about the action. But I think the most satisfying part of this is the part that kind of starts at the beginning and goes right to the end. You speak to the practitioners, you find out what their problem is, you figure out which data they're willing to share, then you do your thing, and write up the paper in a responsible way that will impress your colleagues. And after that, you go out and you lobby for the thing that you think you found, and you get dispute resolution done right, or you get the payments, the mobile payments done correctly. And that's going to be months and months of your time, which may or may not help your academic career, but they're incredibly satisfying moments because the need is great. Okay, now, with that as a setup, I'll introduce a panel of practitioners because this is the network. These are the people that have the data and the connections and can tell you what the right questions are and all that stuff. And we're just going to talk a little bit, and afterwards in the happy hour, you can interrogate them and maybe shake some data loose or something like that. Fair enough? Okay. All right, so we have here on the panel, I'm going to go in order from closest to me. David Connolly, Director of Learning Evaluation Research at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Prior to joining USIP in 2018, he spent 13 years at universities and think tanks working at the intersection of research policy and practice in fragile and conflict-affected states. And it's a long list: South and Southeast Asia, East and West Africa, and the Middle East. So he's basically all the problematic places you're thinking of. David is your man. He's collaborated with a range of academic disciplines and sectors, including education, climate change adaptation, financial management, and international law. Did I get it right? All right. After that is Lauren. Lauren, Senior Behavioral Change Advisor with Mercy Corps, one of the partners that ESOC and NCIGA have worked with in the past, of course. A gender digital advocacy consultant with Save the Children, US. A consultant with the World Bank's Mind, Behavior, and Development Unit. Her work focuses on global applications of behavioral science and thematic areas such as reducing gender-based violence, improving women's access to employment, and reducing malnutrition. Mike Jobbins leads global affairs and partnerships at Search for Common Ground, where he designs, develops, and manages conflict resolution, violence prevention, and inclusive governance programs, including in Afghanistan. Mike leads search, including now in Afghanistan. Mike leads searches advocacy and partnerships with U.S. and European governments, the private sector and NGO partners. Prior to joining Search, Mike supported training with high-level political leaders in the DRC and Burundi and Africa policy research at the Woodrow Wilson Center think tank. One more, Sarah, these might not be relevant for all of you, but it's relevant for some of you, so listen up. Sarah Smith leads the Cornell Hilton Foundation's Refugees Initiative. Sarah has worked in the humanitarian sector as an educator throughout Asia, Africa, and the Middle East for 25 years. Prior to joining the foundation, she was the head of education, child protection, and youth livelihoods at the IRC, the International Rescue Committee. Okay, so I'm going to ask you folks two very specific questions, and you're going to avoid them and tell stories if you like, or you could answer. I think what we would like to know is this. What kind of evidence convinces your organization? What would you like to see from us that would move you to action? And let me just go in order. I'll start with you, David. Afterwards, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, which you can think about, which is A to E. How does your organization try to get us, to manipulate us to do your bidding? But first, in the easy one, all right? So what evidence convinces you? And let me start with you, David.
Sure, thanks. That's at the intersection I work at. As you read out in my bio, I've never been described as a practitioner. I'm overwhelmed by that. But I'm a former academic doing research, types of research that were covered today, and then moving into, I guess what we could call is sort of a knowledge broker. And I think that's something we want to get at today.
So, but what kind of evidence, if you're the broker, then what kind of evidence does the client want?
Sure. So evidence that is very practical and relevant to, in this case, our programs at USIP, that has been typically done in partnership with our programming staff, practitioners, and one that really gets to the heart of what my colleagues are trying to address. So relevant, precise, clear, and is, in that sense, we can talk about evidence-based policy and the sort of the pejorative term of policy-based evidence, but in a sense that if we take this term of policy-based evidence, research that is very much aware of what's being done on the ground, if you like, and is trying to either solve a problem or to experiment, as we saw in the excellent papers today, and therefore is trying to add value, adding new knowledge, and the testing of ideas. I think that would be the priority in terms of evidence for USIP.
Thanks. Lauren?
Hi, everyone. I think just to build on that, I'm feeling pretty enthusiastic today about so much of what's been shared. Just feeling like a lot of the priorities that I have as a behavioral scientist, as a technical advisor at Mercy Corps, is reflected in much of what you have shared through your presentations. One piece that really comes to mind a lot is that contextual nature, really trying to understand what are people in an individual setting thinking and feeling, what are their preferences, how does that impact how they perceive a service that is being provided for them, or what are their preferences in what conceivably could be designed, and ideally creating space to involve them in the process. So participatory research, participatory program design, these are things that we're constantly learning and exploring, but recognizing those nuances of what leads someone to act in a certain way and make certain choices depends so much on where they are based and the constraints and the shocks and the stresses that they are experiencing, and especially when it comes to crisis settings where one situation is changing really rapidly. So what I really depend on is evidence bases that are nimble, that are adaptable, that are ideally as timely as possible. Something I often struggle with is when someone brings me a framework or a data set and says, well, this is from 2009, is that still relevant to this context? And as we have seen with situations that have been described today, that really isn't necessarily still applicable. There might be trends we can extrapolate, but a lot that remains a challenge. And one more piece that has come up a few times today that's really central and important to me with the evidence that we can build on is ensuring that it's intersectional. So really thinking through those different identity groups that people belong to along lines such as age, gender, displacement status, disability, any kind of criteria that you could think of tied to demographics, but also the groups that one chooses that they identify with or feels most connected to, as well as those, as we've talked about a lot with social norms today, that others might perceive them to be a part of, and really being able to say, how can we control on or understand all of the plausible variation of one's experiences and their identity. And I think that so often we try to identify these characteristics along certain measures, but we can keep pushing that further and try to capture as much as possible, not just what we assume someone identifies with or views as the most central part of their identity, but also asking those research respondents directly. And that's something that I'd like to see us all keep moving forward in our research and evidence collection.
Thanks. Mike?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, let me just say that it's been a great conference. It's been an enormous amount of food for thought. And after you have a lot of food for thought, the dessert better be awesome, or else everyone's going to fall asleep. So I feel the pressure. I think we all do. But I think from my side, at Search for Common Ground, we run at any given time we're running about 150 different projects supporting peace and conflict resolution in Afghanistan, Myanmar, here in the States on political, racial issues, in Congo, Syria, Iraq, just about every place that's been mentioned today, with the exception of Colombia. When it comes to evidence in these kind of engagements, frankly, we don't, and my principal role, you give my bio, is really mostly about partnerships and designing the next set of programs, the next set of things that Search will be doing next year, the year before, and helping my colleagues in all those places. We have about 1,000 staff, a deep commitment to social entrepreneurship, and so it's our Afghan colleagues crafting what we do in Afghanistan, our Nigerian colleagues leading our team in Nigeria. And the role that evidence has in that work is that evidence is by definition the past. It's about what worked in Colombia, it's about what worked here, what worked there. By definition, it's the past. The past is one good thing that can help you figure out what the future is. But more than the evidence, and the reason that these kind of engagements with scholars and researchers are so valuable is because it's everything that comes in addition to sort of the evidence. Like I can read your papers. Sometimes I can't always read them. They're very hard. They're very hard for me to read. But when you,
Thank you for that.
but I try. But what I appreciate is really getting into the deeper kinds of conversations about what about Colombia is replicable in the Sahel. What from that study in Iraq, or like what is the research in Jordan on livelihoods? Like what could that mean for displaced people in Congo and so forth? And so I think that kind of deeper relationship and moving beyond just turning evidence, and hopefully we can work together on evidence, but also how we turn that into a creative conversation about what can work in the future is super important and super valuable for us. Our founder said, would always say 50% of what worked in one place will work in another place, or what worked last time will work this time, but you never know which 50%. and the question is, evidence is incredibly important for us to be accountable to the communities we serve. We take multi-10-year commitments to supporting healthy, safe, and just societies in all these places, and so it's important for us to have that retrospective, to be accountable, and to learn. But more important is that sort of future-oriented kinds of partnership. And maybe the last thing I'd just say, and when we get into the receptions and things, I get to know all of you. When we look and, when I am flipping through the journals or trying to decipher the PDFs, sometimes I feel like when people write about peace and conflict resolution, we're one of the larger NGOs, it's like we're running vaccine trials and people are like testing syringe effectiveness. It's like, dude, it's not the syringe. Like we want to know what's in it that works. And so sometimes when there's like papers that come out and they're like, town hall forums are awesome. Soccer games between minority groups are awesome. It's like, okay, yeah, well, that's not what we're like testing. Like, yes, sure, soccer games can be fine or not fine, just like syringes can be good or not good. But the question is, how do you what are you putting in it? Like, what's the substance that's going in? What's the methodology that's going in? It's not, town halls can work, they cannot work, but a lot of it's about how you do it. Dialogue can work, it cannot work. Media can work, cannot work. And so I think also as we get into some of those also sort of practical conversations too, that's where I'd really love to deepen some of that and also enter into the conversations too about partnerships on that side of things.
Well, I too am very happy to become a practitioner still because now I'm a dreaded donor. I'm going to answer from that perspective, but it also is nice because my job is so much easier than everybody else's now that I'm a donor, academics and practitioners for sure. But basically, what do I need evidence for? I mean, I make very simple, straightforward decisions. What to fund, where to fund it, which organizations to fund, and how to use our influence to get other funders to do things better. And so that's basically my job. And in order to do that job well, I need what I would call sort of the interesting evidence, which is what you all presented today, and some not so interesting data. Carson and I were calling it the plumbing earlier. The process of making the data better is, I guess, the plumbing. But the interesting data that we need, I think, and it's the reason I'm here really, is I came to Carson and colleagues at SIGA to say, look, I have a relatively small amount of money in the grand scheme of things to give out. How do I make my decisions about where to invest? Which kinds of interventions are the best interventions to invest in? So I need cost effectiveness data. I need impact evidence about different kinds of approaches. I think oftentimes the focus is so much on impact evidence, which I, for one, have been advocating for a long time and a big supporter of. I do think that in crisis context, the data on need and kind of the complexities of different contexts are also really important, and important not just for making the case and making the case for other funders to continue to invest in a particular place, but for designing better programs and understanding really what's going on in the community. The less interesting data, honestly, I feel like I'm constantly in search of now. Things like who's doing what? Like, what are all those funders out there? Where is it going? What kinds of organizations? What are all the different national data collection systems out there that are happening? Do they include refugees? Do they not? How do they speak to each other? These kinds of sort of more data system kinds of questions, I think, help me then figure out, okay, where can I invest to make the data ultimately better?
Sarah, dreaded and distinguished one. Can I ask you a follow-up on that? Because, I mean, I think one of our difficulties is that it's relatively easy for us to fund projects. If we come with a proposal to try the dispute resolution thing somewhere else, or to try the mobile salaries somewhere else, or the $50,000 and less grants, even in conflict spaces somewhere else, that one's easy to fund, and we're pretty successful with it. But in order to keep the network going for all the other steps, except E2A, right, we need program funding. And that is harder to come by. So how do we do that? Because we need to train all these young scholars, right? And they have to get to the field.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two things I'll say, and one is from when I used to have to raise all the money for program funding and now project funding. I think that what I found was oftentimes there were ways to sort of creatively embed into your projects program-related activities. I think that is something that can be done very easily with some funders and not so easily with other funders. I think knowing funders' strategies, so one of the things that's been sort of dismaying to me joining a foundation was that it just was a reminder that every institution comes up with its own strategies. We all have our own priorities and our own strategies, and I think it's a similar problem to this sort of project problem. And we all have, and I think all the funders out there who really care a lot about evidence generation and investing in the ecosystem, not just those projects, they still have their interests and they still have the things that they have to answer to their board about. So I would say finding funders, understanding, speaking to their strategy with your program. So use the program and connect it to their strategy. Don't just use their, okay, I happen to be a funder interested in livelihoods for refugees and ECD for refugees. That doesn't mean I'm only going to fund a project on ECD or a project on livelihoods, because I'm also a funder who cares a lot about research institutions in the countries we're focusing on. And so how can I build the scholarship in those research institutions? And that's a strategic focus of ours.
Thank you. Let me switch it around now. And Sarah, you've started to answer this, but I want to give everybody else a chance. When you look at us, the researchers, the university researchers as a resource, or if you're an intermediary like David, when the clients look to you and us as a resource, what's their strategy? What are they trying to get us to get, Ted and Claire and all their bright young graduate students to do?
You want me to answer that?
Please.
Try to answer that? Well, I think I'll take the departure point here on the strategy. The organizational strategy is crucial, and how, to use your words, when we're looking, to outside researchers, how can that expertise, unique expertise, really make a difference in generating new knowledge within one's organizational strategy. I think also, in response to the previous question, I think there's a link there. Cross-comparative research, like we had with the Medicata example, I think opens up from project to program. And that is a very important sort of strategic approach for trying to scale up in that sense. And I think what I'll say, all donors or donors, certainly in peace building, is what we're trying to understand is what is the lasting effects at that programmatic level. As you say, thankfully for the last 15, 20 years, with excellent knowledge at the project level, but what we're looking for is what are the lasting effects at that programmatic level. So looking at more the strategic approach, and I'm talking about building peace.
Thanks. Lauren?
Well, we're in kind of an interesting and unique place at Mercy Corps that we have a robust research and learning team. So the example that Adam shared earlier is just one of many projects that and learning questions that are being explored by our teams at any point in time. And I think something that would be really useful for me is thinking through, well, how do we collaborate together and can have more people who are research and learning team members at Mercy Corps who come from academia, and more people who come from our team and switch back to academia, and this constant interplay between recognizing that we have these shared goals, but then working to grow and engage with the same vocabulary. So making sure that we're speaking the same language. I remember a big thing for me was working on program evaluations and being shown p-values, and someone said, hey, look, your program works, and this decimal point tells you that. And before I became more literate in statistics, I was like, I don't really believe you. I'm not sure what that means. And that was a very simple but clear example of the fact that there was a whole area of study that I was just missing that made it much more hard. It made it a lot harder for me to understand the value of my programming, and especially when you're working on difficult to measure concepts such as attitude and behavior change. And I think one place where we can also work more closely together is thinking through, well, what tools already exist? Something that we talk about a lot is, hey, these validated scales that help us measure complex integrated topics such as social cohesion. But I worked with donors who said, oh, well, we saw positive movement in that one question, so that means we increased social cohesion, correct? And we're like, well, no, because it's a set of all these many other questions where we're looking at vertical social cohesion and horizontal and different types of levels of relationship between groups and the citizen and the state, but we're working with funders who also don't fully understand that either, and try to pick and choose which data we can extrapolate to say, well, clearly this program worked. So it's a complicated question, but I think as someone who defines myself as somewhat research literate, but likes to let others, like so many of you in the room, do a lot of that heavy technical lifting, just really making sure that we're continually speaking with the same vocabulary and understanding the way that our work can influence one another and how we can best interpret those results so that we're able to understand the results we're seeing on these really complex topics.
I would say,
Mike, thanks. Yeah, please. On a good day, how do you manipulate us?
Oh yeah, okay. On a good day. Let me tell you about the bad day first. No, so we, like Mercy Corps, we have a pretty big, we have a institutional learning team, and I was talking to the director of the team before this. And she said, well, first of all, tell them what not to do. And I think, you know, and so when we've worked with the bad kind of partnerships we've had with academics have been the profile have been, academics who are like, I've done a study on gangs in Mexico City, and let me tell you how to do your job in El Salvador. And that kind of like, there's the kind of like evident, the kind of degree to which people, maybe it's just sort of a question of like institutional respect, but often we feel that the amount of time that academics have invested sometimes leads them to approach questions in a way that for us as an organization that holds deep accountabilities to the people of El Salvador, to the people of Nigeria, to the people of Sudan, and that's our fiduciary, that's our, not fiduciary, but that's like our core value of who we are and like how we define, that's our core accountability. And so interactions with academics that don't necessarily honor that accountability don't necessarily make us really struggle. And at the same time, I think when academics are trying to influence policy and they're not understanding that the government of Kenya's core accountability is to the electors of Kenya or the U.S. aid to the U.S. taxpayer, I think understanding where each of us have our different sets of core accountabilities, how sacred we all hold those in different ways, I think is one. The second kind of challenge that we've had in working with academics, and this comes to that project versus program kind of distinction, is it's a pretty high transaction cost for us to work on individual projects, no matter how excellent researchers may be, if we're not also building a relationship with the institution, with the research center, with the SIGAs, with the kinds of institutions, because we cover the breadth of the world in a lot of ways, and we can't work with individual international professors or academics on all of them. So we're looking for partners that have a broader scope. And part of that is also gatherings like this one or other kinds of interactions between academics and practitioners, simply to get to know, sure, me, but like more than that, like the, Zora in Afghanistan, in Kabul, Maxwell in Lebanon, Joseph in Myanmar, and other ways to sort of cross-populate, cross-fertilize, to build some of those cross-cultural connections. And I think the final thing, though, I think when we talk about evidence to action, when we would see sort of action and impact, the thing that a group like Search or Mercy Corps or USIP can offer in its partnerships with academics, there are a couple of like holy grails that we're like looking for. There are a couple of things that we really feel that we just don't know. And to take one of them, we could talk, to take one of them, I see very few models at all about how you deliver mental health support at cost, at a low cost in communities where everyone is traumatized, in the Central African Republic, in maybe Sinjar, in the entire country of Myanmar or Afghanistan or whatever. And there's very few models for effectively engaging at the mental health psychosocial support at that level at like an attractive sort of price point where you can actually be providing services. And that's the kind of thing where pilot it obviously needs to be super rigorously evaluated, studied, and then that's the kind of thing that we can then push out across our 60 some odd offices, what works. And I think beyond, I think a lot of, beyond sort of whatever access to data that NGOs or whatever have, and we're often quite comfortable sharing, but whatever access or data we might have, for us, I think the potential to scale and replicate at a pretty big level is sort of what we look to bring. And maybe just the last sort of, if we're throwing around exclamation points, I just want to throw an exclamation point on what David said about I think the other question is really around is collective impact. There's a lot of studies, even the ones we hear today, there's a lot of studies about like peace building at the intervention level, and much less knowledge. And I think we're at a field of existential crisis, given the war in Ukraine, given the fact that places like Congo or Afghanistan have been, among the worst humanitarian crises for my entire life and the life of almost everyone here. So I think the question of like what's the collective impact of the field, what's the strategic impact, how are we learning about not what makes an effective intervention, but what makes an effective sort of strategy in addressing the complexity that can actually support Congolese as they rebuild their society from war to peace beyond sort of just a cluster of sort of good and suboptimal things that get done over a fixed time period.
Thank you. Sarah, anything to add on action to evidence?
Well, I think mainly just putting a fine point on even your question, I think the action to me and maybe my message to all the great researchers out there is starting with the policymakers and putting yourself in their shoes and thinking about what kinds of decisions they need to make and what kinds of questions they need to have answered. And that's a dialogue with those people because it's sometimes much harder. You all are experts at framing questions that can be answered. And knowing how to answer a certain kind of question. But I think oftentimes people who are, racing to respond to a crisis or to implement a program and start it up, they don't have the time and the space to think about exactly what is the question that's going to help them best. And so sitting with them and thinking about what's going to make their policy better. And as simple as, what are the outcomes that they're really seeking? What is their theory of change? And that work at the outset, I think, is something that you all have that others really don't have and can bring into the action sort of camp. I think also just one maybe plea is, Ellie, I think you mentioned that now the field has changed. I think that academics still take a long time to produce findings, and things could speed up a little bit, and it would be really helpful. Don't wait to publish.
So let me just pick up on this because I think the argument for why SIGA rocks is that we give you one-stop shopping, which gives access, and it has been doing this for a long, long time. The argument for why SIGA should do more in conflict is that, well, the proportion of people who are really, really in need in the world who are going to be in conflict spaces is predictably just growing, because those are the places where the governance is broken and where it's hard to get things fixed. Let me take you to one more aspect of this. Then again, I promise to tell stories. So as part of that same story, the first time that I got off a plane in Afghanistan, I was with Mike Callan and Jay Lyle, who you guys all know, and we went to USAID. That was like almost our first stop. We slept and woke up and we went to USAID, and they told us about all the wonderful stuff they were doing, and they paraded in the NGO representatives, and they told us about all the wonderful stuff they were doing. And they were a very impressive group of people. The USAID folks had mostly come from Colombia because they thought that if it worked in Colombia, there was a 50% chance. They thought 100% chance that it was going to work in Afghanistan. But they were a little frustrated because things were going badly already in the summer of '09. And then the NGO folks were very, these are people who they'd sent their all-star teams for the most part to Afghanistan because they know it was going to be hard. And so there were probably 100 years of field experience in the room. And so I learned almost nothing because they told us about all the great things they were doing, and they didn't tell us about the problems. But one of them took me aside and said, "Listen, I'm the head of the team. I won't name the NGO, but are you available tomorrow evening?" I said, "Yeah." Do you have a place that? Yeah, we have a place. It's safe. We're gonna work it all out for you. But he took me aside. The funder's not going to be there. Like the AID folks, they wanted to talk to us, to our research team, without the funder present. And so they found this place for us, and we sat around and we all had a beer. And then they said, "What do you want to know?" And I said, "Well, I want to know what your theory of change is." And at this point, they brought in everybody, the heads of all their groups from the entire country. So now there were like probably 200 years of development experience in the room. And I said, so, when you dig the well, you told us this afternoon or yesterday at AID all of the great things you're doing. When you dig a well in a place that, the Ally controls by day and Taliban control by night, how is the digging of the well going to shift it over to like a well-governed place that the Ally controls, the Afghan government controls during the day? And they kind of went around the room until the head of it, and they a couple of people tried, and then the head, their boss, cut them off and said, "Professor, that's what we brought you here to tell us." And I think it was a stunning moment, because at that point we realized that the emperor had no clothes. All the folks at AID really didn't have a working theory of what was going to happen here, of how the intervention, which was, again, billions of dollars would be spent. They didn't have a working theory at that point of how it was going to create any kind of a change. And neither did their implementing partner, but they didn't want them to know. But they were very frank with us. And I resist the urge to guess, because you should never do that, especially, given your reputation. And we said, well, this is what we're here to find out. You're going to give us data, and we're going to do our thing. And it's going to take us a while, Sarah, but we're going to come back with an answer. And I think, 2 years after that, I think we had a pretty good answer. And 1 year after that, I had an answer that I was confident telling them. Again, over coffee and not to be quoted away. And what I'm hoping is that I'm saving you all lots of time ingesting way too much alcohol with practitioners, and with the remaining brain cells, you can have a longer career, and that'll be good. But I think the theme, if you haven't figured it out yet, of this story is that tomorrow we'll see this again at ESOC. We'll have people from the U.S. military, mid-career officers, who are thirstier for knowledge than any graduate student I've ever had. And really for two reasons. One is these are colonels, majors. They're on their year off. Some of them are at Stanford, actually, or here at Berkeley, or at Princeton. They're in their year off, and they have these two things that really motivate them. One is they've spent the last 10 years of their lives fighting these horrible conflicts, and they think that maybe they've learned something, but mostly they've learned that there really wasn't a doctrine for most of that time, and they want the people that do this next time to learn from what happened. The second thing is that in all the new challenges that they're being faced with, the disinformation and the deterrence, and many of which have a lot of social science in them, the arrival rate of new problems that they weren't trained on when they went to their equivalent of grad school has far exceeded their ability to figure it out by themselves, and they know that. And so they're, in a sense, the best students we've ever had. They're desperate for an answer. They look at you and they say, "Professor, that's what we want from you." And so I think, in a sense, there's a learning opportunity here, which you guys didn't mention, and so I did. But any more comments? Yeah, David.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, the other the lesson I took from your story was accepting failure is incredibly difficult. And I'm quite biased because I've spent the last 20 years in the peace-building field, so I think it's only the peace-building field where this is possible. You'll tell me differently, and especially in a city with its entrepreneurism where, as I understand, failure is accepted and encouraged. This is something that really stood out for me, and it's something we work actively at USIP. As I say, we're fortunate to have a team which is not necessarily to celebrate failure, but to try and bring incredibly busy colleagues out of that space into another space where they can begin to talk about what's not working. And it's something which I've seen over the years as a persistent barrier. And how do you talk about failure? It's really a taboo, certainly in the peace building field. Maybe in other professions, it's not the case. And one way we do it
Well,
is to...
Graham is living proof,
Is to...
right? They had an all-star team of researchers
Yeah.
test something that we all thought was going to work, and it failed. And we know, right? So it's okay with us.
So my last point is, I wonder what role can academics, you all sitting here, help organizations like I work for in trying to better understand failure and to make failure easier to talk about? Because I think that's one of the biggest obstacles, and I'm sure not just for the organizations I know in peace building, but for the field more broadly.
I think just to build on that, something that we also talk a lot about in behavioral programming is the idea of incentives. And that came up in a couple of the presentations today, and I think it's really important for all of us to remember as we come together in collaboration to think about what our individual incentives are as institutions. And for people who are seeking tenure track, yours is going to look very different than someone who's just trying to deliver humanitarian needs to meet someone, or humanitarian services to meet someone's basic needs. And in each of these cases, we can work to figure out those trade-offs to make sure we're capturing that high-quality evidence and information, but also remembering the people who are participating in our programs, who are engaging in our civic engagement activities or any sorts of work that we're doing, and that we each are coming with our own biases as practitioners as well, be it as researchers, be it as program designers and managers, and thinking through what drives us on a personal level, but also on a professional level to help us understand what are we each bringing to the table and how can we square that so we recognize, hey, we know we have our own biases, we know we have our own preferences for what we're going to accomplish through this, but what ultimately is the most important, especially when we're working on big questions such as peace building and conflict prevention and mitigation.
I think I would just add, I think is, the learning, I appreciate the story and the focus on learning. I think that's both from the academic as well as the practitioner community, and even just for myself, having kicked around this for a little bit. Just appreciating in awe sort of the devilishly complicated problems that we all work on and where literally not one person on the planet has a solution for. We work on issues here in the US, race, politics, political violence. And it's not one of the 300 whatever million of us has a perfect, has a solution to that. No one has a solution. Academics don't have any solutions. Perfect solutions. Practitioners don't have any perfect solutions. Policymakers don't have any perfect solutions here or in any other society experiencing these questions. And so I think a lot of, as we enter into this sort of, generating evidence to drive positive action, also the degree to which, it's informed by that sort of creative spirit about how we're forming, how societies are forming themselves and forming their futures together online in light of climate change, in light of global connectivity, and so forth. And I think that spirit as well both leads to better grounded and likely more effective action, but also a way that each constituency is bringing its evidence, both the academic evidence, my colleagues around the world would say we have plenty of evidence. We've grown up here. I've just been, and so forth. Policymakers feel like they have their set of evidence or knowledge, and maybe not evidence, but knowledge. And I think bringing the three sort of policy, practitioner, and academic knowledge forms together, I think is probably the best way to tackle probably the toughest challenges on Earth.
Zara, anything to add?
I guess maybe I was going to say no. I don't want to keep everyone. I think and don't hesitate to speak up to donors. Because I think that this I feel obligated wearing this hat, but also I think often there's a concern to donors are very much a part of both problem and the solution, and I think that the story earlier about when the donor was in the room, there's a different conversation, and it shouldn't be like that.
Thank you, and thank you all. I'm going to open it up to questions now, bearing in mind that the sooner we move to the conclusion, the sooner we're happy houred. But and could you identify yourself, the woman in the striped shirt?
Hi, folks. My name is Nessa Kenny, and I work for Innovations for Poverty Action. I know many of you in the room, which is exciting. It's nice to see you all again. I think, as has been talked about many times today, we know a lot more than we did 15 years ago, and I think that that's thanks to the efforts of a lot of people in this room. I think especially for forced displacement in the last sort of 4 or 5 years. But I think overall of that evidence as kind of like, bear with the analogy, like streetlights on a really, really dark street. You know? So we know now a little bit more about community policing, and we know now a little bit more about alternative dispute resolution. But I wonder, I guess my question for you is, where do we install the next street light? So if we can marshal our resources together as sort of an academic and evidence to action community, where do you think we should point that next light? And Mike, you kind of started to get at this in terms of MHPSS that's low cost, that can be delivered at scale. But yeah, what are those areas that you really want us to sort of marshal our collective efforts towards? Thanks.
Go for
Sure,
it.
I'll take 2. I'll throw out 2, and we can all of us, if we throw out enough streetlights, then maybe we'll all get home safe. I guess 2. One is, it came up a couple times in the social cohesion thing, and I know there's I think agreeing to to having more common measures of social cohesion that can be used across projects, across implementers, across, and sync up with SDGs and meet the kinds of things that donors want. But I think having a much more robust sense of how you measure social cohesion at scale across projects, and things like that, I think that would be really exciting. MHPSS, I threw out, I think that's in some ways, at least for search, that's definitely a holy grail. I think the other one that was really interesting by the Cote d'Ivoire presentation is, for the places where we work, think about how societies are forming online. And so much of the discussion about like the health of online ecosystems, Venezuela as well, are evolved in the US context or India or Myanmar, but places that are much higher penetration. And there's a much less investment on how you make people's first online experience a good one, and how you help very deeply divided societies coming online in the Sahel, in Yemen, or for the lower classes of society, they're just now coming online. And so I think there's a huge amount of opportunity for like tip of the needle interventions, because if we know if 35% of Ivoirians are online now, we know it'll be 100% in a decade. So, how do we sort of correct the tree while it's young? How do you support the Ivoirians to build a healthy online ecosystem? So I think that's another example where that sort of tip of the needle could be really helpful in any number of places.
Could I just put an exclamation point on that one? I would love to see a deplatforming experiment. A deplatforming experiment of hate speech or the kind of stuff in a developing country context. So, the distinguished looking, Could you tell us who you are, though?
Yes, Jim Stein. I'm not an academic, but I am a retired USAID Foreign Service officer. I have 32 years. So I guess I'm sort of a practitioner / donor to some extent. I'm here just because recently moved to Northern California and I want to stay involved and engage in international development issues. But one thing I would say is to Sega and others is, in academics, in bringing evidence to action, is I think AID really needs to improve its sort of the channels in a sustained way of having communication and a dialogue with institutions like Sega. Because in the field, for example, if I was the head of a program and we had a strategy that had been approved with some basic objectives that we had approval from Washington to move forward on, it was up to us to develop the projects, right? And I might have been in the position to say, okay, let's go forward with this project design. And in AID, I think we've done a lot better recently, and I think Nancy Limborg expressed that as well, about bringing evidence into how we do designs and actually having theory of change. What's your theory of change, in doing this program? I was in Afghanistan as well, maybe, I think a few years after your drinking sessions there. But, and often it's hard, it isn't being done in a way that I would say, let's do it to be a literature review. Okay, what do we know? Well, what is the evidence in this field? I'm not speaking only of conflict prevention, but others as well. it was often hard to find, sort of knowing about all that cutting-edge research and evidence that has been produced when you're in the field. Even when I asked Aid Washington, there's Center for Development Information and Evaluation, for example. There's other places and technical bureaus that do have a lot of expertise, but it often wasn't easy to get that. So I would say to you, find ways, and this has to come from AID as well and other donor organizations, find ways to have sort of a sustained dialogue about what you're doing and what the evidence shows, so that, and make sure that the publications are available, so that, when we're developing and designing programs, we can really see what the evidence does show for effective programs. Thanks.
As you were speaking, one thing that it prompted me to think of, and that comes to mind a lot, is thinking through this opportunity to consider the format that we share information as well. So what does it really mean to make that evidence, to make those papers accessible? And something that comes up a lot in my work is speaking with my colleagues around the world, and one of the most recent examples is working on mentorship programs in a couple of different contexts, and realizing that in each of the languages in those countries that it is impossible to translate the term mentor in a way that has the same meaning as in English. And that is fundamentally very difficult when you are trying to design a program that is a mentorship model, but when it's very easy for people to explain what we're trying to do in English, but not so much in the especially nuanced and local languages, our teams are really struggling when they're trying to design focus groups to try to capture that information in the first place. And that one is a really clear example to me of just what are we even doing, and is a mentorship program the right thing if there isn't even a term for mentorship in this context? But what it also reminds me of is the fact that so much of the insights that we are able to produce are often in these very long and cumbersome reports that might be behind paywalls, that might be only in English or a few dominant languages, or they aren't tied to storytelling and narrative in the way that others can interpret it. And I think this is just a really great opportunity to capture insights from folks in the field, especially who also want to use this data and who end up privileging our insights as people that they view as experts, as their technical advisors like myself, as their academics like many of you in this room, and saying, well, you obviously know this because you know how to interpret the information that is provided. But being able to understand that power dynamic and share our insights in ways that are accessible to other communities, especially when they have limited time to absorb that information because they have so many other priorities, and honestly might also be experiencing trauma and the impact of conflict themselves based on living and working in the communities where they're from. So just a reaction that I think it's important to think about, not just how are we communicating or what insights we're communicating, but how are we doing it, and a chance to really challenge those current power dynamics.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the panel, and as you move yourselves back, for your frankness and your humor.